Welcome to another session of Lifting Your Spirit, a monthly broadcast in which we interview people about their spiritual lives and how they suggest helping others lift their spirit. I'm Reverend Joel Grossman, Interfaith Minister, Director of Spiritual Services for Constellation Hospice, and also offer spiritual coaching virtually on a donation basis.
And I'm Ted Jones, a meditation teacher at North Shore Insight Meditation Center.
Our show is based on the following four principles. Number one, everyone is spiritual. Sometimes we are conscious and active regarding our spirituality, sometimes not. But even when we're not, we're still spiritual.
Second, there are many ways to lift your spirit, not just through religious practices, but also through nature, art, human relationships, and service to others. That's just to name a few.
And number three, each person's spiritual path is unique and may change in small or large ways over time.
And finally, fourth, it's important to respect your own spiritual journey, trusting that one step leads toward the next, and to respect other people's unique spiritual journey, even though it may be very different from your own. And we're not here to convince you of the benefits of any particular path or approach, but rather just to give you some food for thought.
So we're very pleased to have as our guest today Mike Houlihan. Mike and his wife Beth run the Roots to Wings yoga studio in Newbury, a beautiful space, and it's much more than a yoga studio. They have concerts and all kinds of things that you'll hear about and hear more about Mike's life. So welcome, Mike.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
Great to be here.
pleasure to have you. And as you know, I hope you saw my email that we start off the show asking people to share about their spiritual journey. So
Yeah, sure. When the kids were young, we decided that maybe they should have a little bit of a religious upbringing. So we decided to bring them to a church in the local area. And I was really struck by the minister there. There was something in her eyes that just kind of said, she knows something and I want to know what that is. And she sort of maybe saw the same thing in me, so she kept kind of bugging me to, well, come see me. And I put it off because I just wasn't quite ready to go to wherever she might want to take me. But after a newcomer dinner one evening, when Beth was pregnant with our second child, I was there late at kind of cleaning up, and it ended up being only her and I in the church, and we were having this in-depth conversation. And it was over the course of that conversation that I had an experience that I had had many times in my life, but I had didn't label it or know it as a spiritual experience. And essentially what was happening was, as I was looking at her and sharing deep truths, about my life and my journey and the things that happened to me in my life, I began to experience some visual changes in my field of vision. Her face became brighter, more sheen. Her face actually even took on like little different qualities, different faces even, in fact. And I was kind of unnerved by this, because any other time that I had ever experienced anything like that in my life, I looked away and disengaged from that, because I just, something might have been a bit of something in my soup, like Scrooge said, right? And I started to tell her what was happening to me. And she said, oh, that's the same thing's happening to me. And it completely stopped me in my tracks, because I had never had anybody validate an experience like that. And I said, what is it? And it took me probably 6 months to say what so easily can roll off the tongue now. But what happens is, she said, when you get into a situation with people where you're sharing deep truths, there's an exchange of energy that begins to happen. And when that exchange of energy happens, we begin to see reality as it is, rather than as the conditioned mind thinks it is. And one of, like Aldous Huxley's, doors of perception, the doors of perception begin to spring open, so it can create changes in our visual field, and that's what was essentially was happening to me. And I was so excited about this that I wanted to continue to meet with her right away. And so we began to have a series of meetings where she asked me to, write down every spiritual experience I'd ever had in my life. And so I made a list of all these spiritual experiences as far back as I can remember. And then we started to go through them. And over the course of those conversations, which was over a series of weeks, it would be great if there were other people that were interested in this. And she says, well, it so happens that there's 3 or 4 other people who I'm having similar kinds of conversations with, and I think you might like them. And so we created a mystics group, which met every Thursday night at a friend's house in Newburyport, and we did kind of contemplative Christianity practices based on some of the work of Father Thomas Keating. And I got very, very interested in that. And that group was together for about 3 or 4 years, probably 4 years before people had kids and jobs and moved out of the area and things like that, and sort of disbanded. It was during that time that my wife introduced me to yoga. I'd had a little bit of understanding that yoga had a meditative and peaceful sort of aspect to it, but I really wasn't. I was a hockey player, golfer, mountain biker, mountain climber. I was very active doing stuff with the guys, and I didn't really think yoga was part of that. But I had been in the corporate world for probably 20 years at that point, and I was doing a lot of traveling, flying around on airplanes and eating restaurant food and things like that. And my body started to feel older than I thought it should feel for my age. And I noticed some changes in my wife, who had been doing yoga for 3 or 4 years at that point. And I kind of put it in the back of my head, and maybe I should try that, but I kept resisting. And she eventually convinced me to go try a yoga class. And this was at the old Roots to Wings Yoga and Healing Center over in Byfield, which is across from the library. And it was owned by a woman named Wendy Hall. And I decided to go, basically so she'd stop asking me to go to yoga. And I went, and it was kind of interesting because the upstairs studio was undergoing some renovations or something at that point. And there was a lobby downstairs, which was basically in an old 1800s barn, all wood, beautiful old building. And so the class was on the first floor that day, and I lay down on the yoga mat, and within the first 5 minutes I had this overwhelming sensation of home. This there was I was searching at that point while I'm traveling, leaving my kids, to go across the country and travel. And I grew up without a dad, so I was really having some misgivings about being away from my family. And so it was difficult for me. So I was trying to read self-help books and learn how to meditate and read books about how to meditate, but none of it was really landing with me. I couldn't establish myself in anything that was really tangible. But when I laid down on the yoga mat, I felt something. And that feeling, I got more and more curious, and I started to go once a week and then a couple times a week. And I was still in the corporate world at that time, and gradually, became a regular yoga practitioner there. And it happened that Wendy was moving on to run a large spiritual center in somewhere in New Jersey, and she asked Beth and I if we would be interested in taking over the studio. And I wasn't sure, but we said, well, we'll run the studio for a year while I was still working and see how it goes. And things worked out, then we'll negotiate a purchase of the studio, and that's what we ended up doing. But that's the business side of it. That's not specifically what you asked about the spiritual journey. So it's about 6 months into yoga now, and I approached yoga the way I approached everything else in life, which is I'm going to conquer yoga. And so I'm going to bring my athletic, energy to yoga. And so yoga was excruciatingly painful for me for probably the first 6 to 8 months, because I was trying to do what everybody else did, and my body wasn't ready to do that. And I was stubborn enough that I was going to try to force my body to get into those positions, no matter how much it hurt, And there was a workshop that my wife and I had attended, and we're actually having this workshop at Roots to Wings in early November. It's done by a Korean Taoist teacher by the name of Chun, who recently came back to the greater Boston area. But the workshop at that time, the name of the workshop was called Finding Your True Self. And last thing that I wanted to do was get stuck in a room with a bunch of women, be made to feel like I have to cry and open my heart. Like that was, there was no worse thing that you could. But they were working on me to go to the workshop. Well, it so happened that the workshop got moved to Byfield for some reason from Jamaica Plain in Boston. So now I have to go because it's right there. I can't avoid it. So I go to the workshop, and over the course of that 3-day weekend, I made a soul connection, which was a very familiar experience to me, but I couldn't say that I'd actually ever had that experience in this lifetime. Like I couldn't really remember a moment when I had that feeling, but I knew the feeling intimately. And I was so transfixed by this experience that I went up to Chun Shim at the end of the workshop and said, I need to, take me to your leader. I have to learn more about this. And I was working in Portsmouth for a Canadian oil company at that time. I was running technology for a Canadian oil company, and I was responsible for all of the gas stations, basically, the technology that supported the gas stations across U.S. and Canada at that time.
Is that Irving?
And I got out of, and I got out of work every Friday at 2 o'clock and drove to Newton, Mass to do a healing session with Chun Shim. And I had signed up for 10 healing sessions with Chun Shim. So it was kind of, at that time, to work with her, it was sort of either you're all in or you're not in at all. So you had to make a big commitment up front to work with her. And I was so interested and curious because of the experience that I had with her that I was ready to make that commitment. And I came home and told Beth what I had done, and she was, what are you doing? We don't have that kind of money. And it didn't matter. I wanted to. So I started working with Chun Shim, and over the course of the next couple of years, my whole life changed pretty dramatically in terms of I eventually left the corporate world. I did, change my friend groups, not because the people that I was hanging out with were bad, but I just became more interested in, what yoga and healing and meditation could do for me. And so that's a really condensed version of my spiritual journey, which has continued, since that time. Mm-hmm. And so we eventually made the decision to purchase Roots to Wings after operating it for a year. We operated it in Byfield for about 7 years, and it was to operate a yoga studio successfully, you need to have some form of scale, because we didn't have unlimited resources to pour money into the yoga studio as much as we would have loved to have been able to do that. But we had 4 kids, so and I had given up a perfectly good corporate job, that paid the bills to be able to move to a yoga and healing center. And so in the early days, it was Beth and I, a woman by the name of Arlene Damon, who you may know, and a woman by the name of Kathleen Perrin, and that was the core Roots to Wings team. We had maybe 12 or 15 classes a week. After 7 years, it sort of became apparent that it may not be sustainable, and we were at a kind of a decision point where either we're going to go all in, or we're going to get out of this and go do something else. And Beth and I both wanted to still pursue this path, because owning and operating a yoga and healing center has nothing to do about making money or how big it is or anything like that. It's all about it is our spiritual practice, and that's how I stay connected. And I'm sort of dumb enough that I need a big hammer I need to have a yoga class to teach. I need a workshop to run. I need to bring people in that helps keep me in a place of connection and keep me mindful. So we need that. So we decided, I scoured Newbury and Newburyport for land, and I identified a list of about 12 different properties that we were decided to target, and I went and approached every one of the owners of those properties to see about what the prospects were of building a yoga and healing center there. And none of them really were totally the right fit. I didn't feel quite right about them. And then I remembered this property on Route 1 in Newbury. I grew up in Newbury, so when I was a kid. And I can remember that it used to be a Phil Wanted site, so you'd go and dump your leaves and your brush and everything there. And there was I'd remembered in later times that there used to be like a for sale sign, like an old metal for sale sign, sort of going across, whatever makeshift driveway they had going in there. And I went over to that piece of land. I wasn't even sure. And I pulled through the pricker bushes and stuff and found that sign. And I did a little research and found out who owned the property. And it turned out to be a guy that I had met at Old Newbury Golf Club with my grandfather when I was a young boy, when I used to play golf at Old Newbury. And I said, well, I'm just going to go see this guy. So his name was Jerry Pimentel. And his property abutted our property there now. He was out in his tractor, and he was in his 90s, I think, at that point. And I walked up and said, "Hey, Jerry, this is Mike Houlihan, Ernie Walton's grandson. And do you remember me?" He said, "Oh yeah, you look a little different than you did when I." And I said, "Jerry, I've got a crazy question for you. Would you have any interest in selling that lot of land that you've got?" And he was, "You know what? I would. I need the money." And that's how it happened. And so it took almost a year to get all the approvals that we needed to build that building in Newbury. There aren't that many commercial buildings that go up in Newbury, and so there was a little extra scrutiny on that. But I knew that we were well within our, we could do it if we could, get through the process. And then it took us another 6 months to build the building. We were taking a huge risk. We moved everything over to Newbury, and it opened everything up. The proximity to Newburyport and to State Street, and allowed us to expand. And we expanded our teaching team. We expanded the number of classes that we had and the programming that we were able to offer. And it was going completely gangbusters right up until COVID. So I'll pause there.
Well, you guys have a connection.
Yeah, you may know this. Thomas Keating was my uncle when he was alive.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I think Tricia had told me that. Yes.
So I'm curious about your time in that Christian meditation group.
Yes. Yeah.
Also, going back further, because you had said, that you and Beth wanted your kids to have some religious education.
Right.
Did you have any growing up?
I did. I went to the Immaculate Conception Church in Newburyport.
Okay.
And so when we ended up, and my wife grew up Protestant, and she was from Reading, Mass. And so when we had kids, it was kind of, what do we do? And we landed on the First Parish Church of Newbury. Which, of course, my grandfather had been rolling over in his grave to know that I was going to that church. My grandfather had been in this area for a long period. That's a totally different, and interesting, but a totally different story. And so we decided to go to that church once we checked it out. Yeah.
That's interesting to me for another reason, which is in my family there was mixed marriages like that, and that there was a certain point where the Catholic Church was very adamant that that the kids had to be brought up Catholic if someone was marrying a Protestant spouse.
Right.
But that would probably be true only if you're getting married in a Catholic church.
My grandfather was always, why don't you marry a nice Catholic girl? He was, he was pretty old school in his dogma, and but by the time that I had come of age, that sort of had dissipated, and I think we got married in a Presbyterian church in Bedford, New Hampshire, actually. So, where her family had a few marriages, weddings up there. Yeah.
So you had a transformative experience with the pastor,
Yes.
and
Her name was Minister Reverend Nancy Haverington.
and that moved on to the Christian contemplative group.
Yes.
I'm wondering what that was like in terms of you had gotten a pretty heavy dose of Catholicism
Mm-hmm.
growing up,
Mm-hmm.
and so that was in some ways a kind of a return to that.
Well,
but from a completely different angle.
It was. I have to fast forward a little bit to go back to that story, because it was, I was around those times that I was reading sort of lots of things. And one of the books that I had read early in my yoga journey was Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. And I was really struck in that book. The most interesting part of that book is the footnotes, actually. If you just read the footnotes at the end, and because that's where all the detailed information is. But I was sort of amazed by, and there was another thing, the movie The Da Vinci Code had come out, and it was, for me, the movie Da Vinci Code was entertaining, but it also I started asking a lot of questions. It was possible that any of those things are true. And so I started reading some books. I read Thomas Jefferson wrote a book about all of the quotations that could have reasonably been attributed to have been said by Jesus, which was a great book. There was a number of books on Mary Magdalene. There was a philosopher from the Harvard Divinity School who wrote a couple of books. I think her name was Elaine Pagels. Maybe you've heard of her. And so I was able to, I kind of did a little research on some of these things that were presented in the movie The Da Vinci Code, because Paramahansa Yogananda had made me curious about it. Sort of, the Eastern traditions actually had a way of spinning Christianity back to me in a way that I understood it a lot better, what it was all about, rather than just going through the rituals. Like, why are we doing these rituals? What do they mean? And so I became really curious about that. And so it wasn't really as much were any of the things in the Da Vinci Code true. Was that the exact story? Is that how it went down? But it got me kind of wondering, what if God was who said God was a man? Where did I get that belief from? Right, and so that kind of got me down a road to kind of expand my awareness, I guess, in a way, if you will, to include the possibility that some of these other things might be true. And so it was. By the time I got to the mystics group, I was sort of open to that. Reverend Nancy was also very open to those things as well, and she had been to Harvard Divinity School, and she brought those sort of practices to us. So what we used to do, centering prayer was a big part of that, chanting, automatic writing, candle gazing, and something called encountering, which I don't know if Father Thomas Keating coined that phrase, or if Ram Dass actually coined that phrase, but it's the eye gazing, where you stare into somebody's eyes for some period of time, and then there's lots of different things that can happen from that experience, from the phenomenological visual experiences to using it as like a method of kind of didactic inquiry, lots of things. And so we practiced that quite a bit. But for me, being a stressed out corporate executive, it was the practices that eventually led to automatic writing that really got me to slow down and develop a sense of peacefulness. Because during the automatic writing, and the exercise that she had us do was basically your pencil couldn't leave the paper, you just write for however many, 3 or 4 minutes. And I use this exercise today with some folks when we do programs at Roots to Wings. And I became so interested in it'll sound kind of weird. I don't know if it'll come through to whoever's listening to this, but writing, if you can envision writing on a piece of paper, and a piece of paper is made by layers of little, fine fibers, and the lead going across those fibers would create like a little explosion or a little dust. What was in one of these automatic writing sessions that I really became, could I hear and feel, this sort of like this, could I get to the moment where that lead is sort of, becoming powder, on the paper. And that was really helped me slow down and center myself.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I would have kept going with that mystics group, and did. But I met Chun Shim Nim. But the interesting thing about the mystics group experiences was a lot of those experiences bring energy up, because when you're doing eye gazing and things like that, and you're having visual experiences. If you're not prepared for that, you might see some things that could unnerve you a little bit.
Yes, yes,
right?
absolutely.
And so if you're staring at somebody and all of a sudden, you start to see into their skeletal structure, or you see molecules or whatever it is, that can be really unnerving. And I had spent my life, bringing my energy up. And Chun Shim Nim had taught me that, most of the time people walk around like an upside down triangle energetically. So all of our energy is up, and that can create a whole host of health issues, high blood pressure, heart problems, headaches, dizziness, nausea, all of which began things that were beginning to happen to me in my corporate life. And her teaching was to learn how to bring energy down. So she said you have to be careful with the mystical practices, because you don't want to leave your body to do those. It might not be great for your health based on what was going on with me. It didn't necessarily apply to anybody else, but for me, that was. And so I began to do practices that would help me ground as I was doing the mystical practices at the same time. And I was sad that the group kind of eventually, but that's the way of all things.
Right. And you're certainly grounding your mystical experience with the yoga studio.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it's wonderful. Do you know about Ezekiel's vision? Did that
Tell me.
come up?
I not as well as you, probably.
Ezekiel had this vision of looking at somebody, and they became 4 different animals. And so with a workshop with the Buddhist teacher in Santa Fe, I'm blocking her name, does a lot around death. Well, anyway, it'll come to me. She had this was at Omega, stare for 15 minutes in someone else's eyes. And I started to have what you're describing. Yeah. An eagle, a lion, like Ezekiel did. So
wow.
I relate to what you're saying.
Yeah. It's a great practice.
Yeah.
It's a great practice.
My experience of that practice was informally back in college on MDA, which is very closely related to MMDA or ecstasy, which is now getting a lot of research into how that can be used therapeutically. But that experience, which was then, this is the only other time that this happened, I was at a Oscar Achazo workshop of some kind.
And picking grapes.
Yeah,
that was one of his exercises.
And Eureka Institute.
Uh-huh.
And it was a exercise called Trespasso, and that your one eye is looking into the other person's one eye. And it was the same experience for me, where there was a complete loss of any kind of individualization, that it was a meeting at the point where there was no separation, that it was just one consciousness, that we were there, and that inspired my whole spiritual practice back, this is, years, 50 years ago. But I think that it is so powerful. I mean, I had one other similar experience where I was looking at a practitioner. I was trying to decide whether I wanted to do body work with her. She was a healer, and I was looking at her and looking at her and looking at her and looking at her, and her face changed, and it became my face.
Ooh.
And so I'm really resonate with what you're saying, that it's extremely powerful, and it can take us into realms that are much deeper and a different reality than we kind of experience in our
Yeah, it's great to meet
day-to-day.
people who've had those experiences, and there's lots of those people. There's a community of those people. There are people who've had those experiences and don't know, what they are or how to do anything with them. And it was really sort of you could say it was an accident, or you could say it was preordained. I'm
Yes.
not sure. Which that I met. That happened at the First Parish basement of the First Parish Church of Newbury after midnight on a fall evening.
Your experience with her, and then with, I can't pronounce his
Chun.
name. Chun. Wonderful examples of that expression. When the student is ready, the teacher appears.
Yes.
It seems like, why did this happen? Well,
Right. Yeah, Chun is, she's a person who I guess I would call her like a love dog, in that she doesn't have a big website, she doesn't write books, she doesn't have a podcast, she doesn't, it's very hard to
Great.
find, you
Wonderful.
can't find her really. But if you get a chance to spend time with her, she's a phenomenal guide, and one of the great things that's happened over the last 17, 18 years of doing this is I had a chance to meet some really amazing people. And in fact, I was thinking, as I was driving over here, is one of the things that I wanted to make sure that I got across. I at the point in which I began my spiritual journey, I was very comfortable. I was financially comfortable. I had a house, I had kids, beautiful wife, the 2 cars. We didn't have a dog, but I could have one if I wanted one. And I had my golf buddies and my hockey buddies, and I didn't need anything. I wasn't looking for any new friends. I was completely contented with my life in almost all aspects. Yet I had this sort of overwhelming sensation that something was missing, and it was like there was like this storm cloud was kind of following me around, and it hadn't started to storm yet, but if it did, it wasn't going to be good. And that's sort of like that was the energy of I saw something in Minister Nancy, and I knew it was related to that, but I didn't really want to. I put it off for a while, and then I eventually, and once I started to go to that, things really opened up. And the people that I've met since, we got involved with Roots to Wings back in the early days, which would have been about, for Beth, it probably was like 2004, and for me, it was probably about 2006 that I first got involved in Roots to Wings. And I can't imagine how sad my life would have turned out not having met the people that I've met since that time, because the people that I could not imagine my life not having met the people that I've met since I started yoga. I've met some just people that, beings that they've taught me so much, so many. I have so much gratitude for the people that I've come across and that we've been able to bring to Roots to Wings and that I've gone to see. And
Well, that leads me to one of my personal high experiences, Hanuman. So
The
if you can
Hanuman.
talk about Hanuman.
yes, The Houlihan. You want to hear about the Houlihan?
Yeah.
I can tell you about. So, it's a great story actually. So I'm in my yoga teacher training at Kripalu, and it was the day we're going to do a 3-hour sadhana. It was a 3-hour long yoga practice basically, and they tell us that there's going to be music, coming, and it's February in Kripalu, and they've got the big windows, and it's snowing, and it snowed the whole time I was there, basically, which was beautiful. And we got so into our practice that it was, an hour and a half into the practice, and I just had, oh, wow, the music never happened. They said there was going to be music, and the music wasn't there. And all of a sudden, the doors kind of fling open, and in comes this guy, and he's carrying all these bags and brown paper bags, and they're wet and ripping, and he's got this big old barn coat on, and he sets his stuff down, and I'm thinking to myself, like, who is this clown? He's in the wrong room. And then I went back to my practice, and he's fooling around, and he starts playing, eventually, drums. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's John DeCat. And I didn't know him, but I knew his music because some folks they used to get played in the classes that I used to take as a student when I was at Rooster Wings back in the early days. And I was just, this is awesome. And it turned out to be phenomenal. And after the class, I went up to John, and I wanted to meet him. And we have since become, great friends. I've seen John a bunch of times. But I was, you got to come and play the drums at Rooster Wings. Will you do that? And I thought nothing would happen. And he calls me up maybe 3 months later and says, hey, Mike, I'm going to be traveling through your area with some friends of mine, and, think we could do something at Rooster Wings on a Wednesday night in the middle of July. And I was like, geez, John, I'd love to do that, but, a Wednesday in the middle of July, that's going to be a difficult. And we were very new to doing music at Rooster Wings. I think we had only had maybe one music event, Kirtan, at Rooster Wings up to that point in time. But I decided to do it. And I didn't know the people. I'd never met the people that he was going to bring. And we hadn't done a lot to promote the event. And I was figured it'd be we'll give them, whatever a few $100, and, that'll be it. And then if people are interested, and they'll turn out. And then a video came out about 2 weeks before the event of the Houlihan, which was, at that time they were known as Sita and the Houlihan, because one of the members of the Houlihan, a guy by the name of Gauravani, was in New Zealand filming a movie, and so he needed a stand-in for him, and so there's this female singer named Genevieve Harrison, who highly recommend. She's an incredible voice. But she was with them, and they played at a place in New York City, and a video came out, and I saw the video, and my jaw dropped. Like, I was immediately, these guys are like top level, exquisite music, and I was panicked and ran around for 2 weeks promoting them, and I think we ended up having like 40 or 50 people the very first time that they came.
Let me just, for our audience, say, Houlihan is a high level kirtan, which is call and response Hindu practice, very high energy stuff. And Houlihan is like a jazz group. I mean, the level of musicianship is incredible for kirtan.
It's the Houlihan are kind of made up of a super group of musicians who all have their own thing, very successful own thing going on, and they got together up until COVID, and had made Rooster Wings one of the places where they came every year. So after the first year, we moved it to the First Parish Church in Newbury, and we did it there for a couple of years. We did it a couple of times at Newburyport City Hall, and then once we built our new building, we brought it back to our building. And I probably shouldn't say, on something that's recorded how many people we had there, but it was a good sized group that we had. And so their music is very near and dear to my heart. They actually are still recording music, and they're in different places geographically in the world. And one of them's in India right now, one's in Portland, Oregon, one lives in Hawaii, one lives in Washington, one lives in Florida. So to get them all together, and the really sad thing about these artists who travel, and make this devotional music, is it's very financially for them. It's at best a break-even proposition. So if you guys, let's say nowadays it'd probably be, you'd have to get $45, $50, $55 a ticket, and people say, wow, that's a lot of money. But for the what happened to me is when I go to those things, it feeds me on a cellular level that takes months to digest an experience like that. The reverberations of those experiences last for a long time, and if you get that, then you have no problem spending the $55. But if you're, looking for just a night out of entertainment, you might miss that. But
When might they come again?
there is talk of them potentially doing something next year, whether that's going to be at, John has created a festival. He has a place out in the Berkshires, out in Lee, Mass, where he's done a couple one-day festivals. He spends half his year in Hawaii and half his year in Lee, Mass, and he created this, which I help him with, Blessed Fest East. I help him with Blessed Fest East, which is the one that he does in Western Massachusetts, and then he created a Blessed Fest Hawaii, where he spends half the year out in Hawaii, where it's a totally different kind of vibe out there, different kind of music, different kind of energy out there, but just as devotional. And it's so there. I don't want to announce anything that hasn't been announced yet, but we're all hoping, praying, wishing that the Hanuman will get together, because COVID sort of put a complete stop to the traveling musician scene. So people just aren't going around doing kirtan, and even getting people into a room, getting 50 people into a room to chant is, people have, in our little pocket of the world, have reservations about doing that also. But we've begun offering chant at Roots to Wings again. We have a guy who comes up from Brooklyn who is, have you heard of Amma, the hugging saint? Amma?
Sure.
Yeah, well, he's her kirtan.
Ah.
And he'll be coming up for the third time since COVID in November. And we have Brenda McMorrow and John DeCat are going to be at Rooster Wings in early October. And Brenda, we haven't seen Brenda in 4 years. When COVID hit, she went to Mexico, and she's been doing amazing things, traveling all around the world. Everybody else is doing kirtan all over the world. It's just something about New England and the greater Boston area where we haven't been able to get folks from the outside to come in because it's difficult financially.
The term kirtan is new to me, and
Okay.
so it might be helpful to give sort of a definition or kind of expanded explanation of
Sure.
where that fits in
So-
spiritual practices.
So that's a very interesting, question. Going back, another story from my Kripalu yoga teacher training days, and when I was there, I went to this thing called Kirtan, and I didn't know, what it was, but it's music, and you might like it. So I went, and there was a guy by the name of Dave Russell, who had been with Ram Dass out at Nairobi, that famous summer in 1974, I guess, where Ram Dass's love service that all got recorded, and many of the older and I guess more venerated kirtan artists like Krishna Das and Jayutal. Everybody's heard of Krishna Das. If you've taken a yoga class, you've heard of Krishna Das, but we're out there at that time, so it was kind of a magical time where they had these in India. During the British occupation, the British couldn't lug their pianos around. And so they invented this small, almost like a polka sort of thing. It was a wooden box. It was basically a very small piano that was wind-fired. So you squeeze it and you can play, musical notes on this. It's called a harmonium. And that became the basis for the development of call and response chanting, which is essentially kirtan, which is an ancient practice, and overseas. And so what kirtan really is you're chanting variations of the names of God and themes of the names of God. So you might say, so everybody thinks of, like everybody's heard, thinks of the Hare Krishnas in the airport, right? And they come, like the Jehovah's Witness, they come and knock on your door and, buy the Krishna book and so Hare Krishna, the Hare Krishna mantra, for example, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. Everybody probably knows that, but they think, oh, it's those weird people with the white dresses and the ponytails. And but Hare Krishna is Hare, it's celebrating the energy of God, basically. So there's Kirtan is gathering with a group of folks to basically chant the names of God, essentially. But as Westerners, I'm not conscious that I'm chanting the names of God. I'm conscious of connecting to a vibration. And for me, I think that vibration is an aspect of God, whatever God is, But so when I was at Kripalu, I met this guy, Dave Russell, and I went to the Kirtan at Dave Russell and Charlie Braun, and I was like blown away mesmerized by these guys, and there's a lot of energy running around the halls of Kripalu, and I couldn't sleep when I was there. So I'm, going down. You can have free tea, and leave the kitchen open, at night, and you can go down and get a cup of tea or whatever you want. So I was wandering the halls, and I saw this guy, Dave Russell, and I walked up to him kind of sheepishly and said, "Hey, can I have a few questions. Did you have a couple minutes?" Yeah, sure, sit down. So we talked so long that his wife eventually came out of the room that they were staying. "Hey, Dave, it's time to go to bed." And he said, "Yeah, I'll be there in a minute." She came out a second time. And we talked for another hour after that, and then finally I convinced him he was the very first kirtan that we did at Roots and Rings, which was call and response chanting. So in Hindu mythology, there are many deities, and there are people who worship those deities like in sort of groups. So some people worship Shiva, and so they're known as Shivites, right? Some people worship Hanuman, and some people are focused on Krishna, but all of that sort of meets together in chanting. Sanskrit is, as you guys, I'm sure is one of the, if not the oldest, one of the oldest known languages, and is basically the language of sound. And so when you repeat these syllables, these mantras like Om, everybody knows what Om is, but if you keep repeating that, then over time the its meaning becomes clear. And so I had all these questions for Dave, who are these saints and who are these guys? And he's like, and what do these things mean? How can I get up to speed on what, the Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya mantra, I wanted, I wanted a literal translation, so when I was chanting it, I knew what I was saying, so I wasn't getting programmed to, I was going to, something bad I was going to end up being a Hare Krishna or something. I don't want to get into the cult before I knew I wanted to, And he said, "Mike, the best advice I have for you is don't worry about any of that. The saints and sages that will be useful to you, you'll know who they are when the time comes, and the words to the mantras themselves the ones you like they'll naturally just resonate with you, and over time you'll understand what they mean without even being able to read the language." And that's happened to some degree over the years. So that's what kirtan is.
So I'll share my kirtan story.
Yeah.
So I'm at San Rafael, California, doing my seminary. I attended one of the 5 interfaith seminaries in the country and became an interfaith minister. And somebody says, Krishnadas is going to be at the bookstore. I had never heard of Krishnadas, who's probably the leading proponent, most well-known of the kirtan. And by the way, kirtan is the leader of the band shares a line that was just shared, and then everybody sings it back, and just keep going that way.
Yeah.
And it starts out kind of slow and a little quieter, and then the energy builds and builds and builds until you're out of your mind, or you're in your mind. Right. So anyway, I had been in a Hindu-based practice called Ananda Marga for 5 years. And Kirtan in our practice was a dance, was a movement that we did for 15 minutes before meditating. So Kirtan to me meant dance. So I was going to this performance in this little bookstore, little side room with Krishna Das and maybe 100 people waiting to dance. And everybody's singing. I'm in the back auxiliary room doing my dance to Krishna Das's. And then I've been with Krishna Das many times since then.
That's
and
awesome.
Then Hanuman is like the epitome of it.
Right.
Yeah.
And then that's a whole, you could do a whole nother thing on that whole, Krishnadas, Ramdas,
Yeah.
Maharaji, that whole, that's a
Yeah,
really
I-
interesting story, yeah.
Absolutely.
Now, you had a question about cold water swimming.
Yeah, I did want to just touch on that.
Yeah.
My understanding is that you go into the ocean regularly during the winter. And I'm wondering about what the benefits about that are, that sort of, to me, seems sort of obvious spiritual connection of just be here now as that feeling of the intense cold. So what is that like for you?
So-
How'd you get into doing that?
Well, it's something, so my wife and I were looking for something to do together. It was when you have 4 kids, we've basically, we have 1 out of college, 1 halfway through, and 2 that just started. And so for the last 22 years, we've been running in opposite directions at 100 miles an hour. So when we can find some time to, do something together as a couple, it's a really good thing. And I had been, as everybody does now, well, maybe not everybody, but I do, you're on Instagram and you're on Facebook and you're scrolling your stuff, and these things came up. And I had come across this guy who you've probably heard of. His name's Wim Hof. Oh, that's a
I don't know.
fascinating guy. So this is a guy that has climbed Mount Everest barefoot, shirtless,
Wow.
and done these amazing, been injected with neurotoxins, and has been able to quiet his mind enough so that he can ward off the effects of being injected with neurotoxins, and has trained other people how to do it. He brings people to Poland, where he gets them into freezing cold water, just basically, 1 level above it being ice, for 25 to 30 minutes in that cold. Trains them, how to do that. And I was like, it's really weird, but there's something kind of interesting about it. And of course, we have this beautiful, pristine beaches where we are. And so Beth and I decided, well, maybe let's just start jumping in the ocean. And this was during COVID. And see-
interesting time to start doing that, yes.
and see what kind of happens. And then we got, so June, fine, July, easy, August, bathwater, September, bathwater, and then we're like,
I would never describe
Right.
Plum Island waters that way in any month.
you would, well, so when it came to the colder months, like the end of October, the water starts getting cold like early November on a relative scale. For
Yeah.
me, it starts getting
Yeah, cool. Okay.
and so it became this interesting ritual. So Beth and I so on her birthday, one of her birthdays, she wanted to go down to the beach, and Beth had this goal of she wanted to 108 days that she wanted to go into the ocean 108 times over the course of the summer, over the course of that 1 year, and which she quickly did that. And then I said I'll do it with you, and so we go down to the beach in the morning and jump in, splash around for a little bit, and then once the weather got colder, we were talking, well, it's kind of, you think we can, I started looking at this Wim Hof stuff, and maybe we can make it through the winter. Let's try. And so as you approach October, I think what happens over time is your body starts to begin to get conditioned to the experience. It's a level of mind training, I guess I would call it, because when you walk down to Plum Island, to lot 6 or whatever lot you decide to go to down there to do it, or where we do it where it's most convenient. The most difficult part of it is taking your shirt and your pants off and walking down to the water, because it's it might be 30, 40, 50 degrees out, right?
Yeah.
And that it heightens all of your senses, and so you're basically you're really on the edge of being in fight or flight mode on your way down to the water. So, and what happens is once you get into the water, you just kind of go right in and you go under. So we've been doing this for about 3 years now, and we've, over the course of the 3 years, we've deepened our practice in terms where we go in, and so it used to be we just go in and kind of jump in, jump out, which is pretty much what you have to do between December and, say, early March, the end of March, because the water can get down into the 30s, so it's actually dangerous to go into the water, and not to mention the ocean conditions, and you're down on the end of the wildlife refuge, and if something did happen, it could potentially trigger a cardiac issue if you weren't ready for that. So you have to. This has never happened to Wim Hof, and it wasn't something that Beth and I were just. We were just. You have this heightened awareness of I'm taking my life in my hands right now. It's sort of like.
Yes.
I've never jumped out of an airplane, and I never would. But going into the ocean has that level. Like this is real serious stuff that we're doing. You can't be. Drinking wine and we'll go down. I don't drink, but we, and let's go jump in the ocean on a lark. Like this is, for me, it's a serious thing that we do together, and it's really, it's been great for us and for our relationship to have something like that we do together. But the benefits of going into the ocean, what I would say more than anything, it's sort of like when you have to reboot your iPhone or reboot your computer or reboot your modem or your router, it's like kind of like hitting the reset button.
Yes.
So if even right now at this time of year, the hurricane just came, so the water is pretty warm. But even going into that water and staying up to your neck for 15, 20, sometimes even 30 minutes, is you have to get through that first. Your body has to become desensitized to that. This is a different temperature. That your body's 98.6 and the water's 68. So it's 30 degrees colder than what your body is, So what? It's really interesting when you do this in the colder months, like in November, December months, when the water temperature is cold, but the air temperature is colder than the water temperature, and you're taking off your clothes to go down into the water. When you come out of the water in November, December, you feel like you could run through a brick wall. Like you could just being in the water for 5 minutes. Longer if you want to, but being in the water for that length of time and coming out of the water, you could walk around with your shirt off for half an hour if it's a sunny day and just feel great. Like it's so invigorating. I did it because I wanted to see if it would have any effect on heart rate, blood pressure, inflammation in the body, and so I've found that it's like that we crave it. So I have to gotta get in, Wrap it up.
Yeah.
She's saying wrap it up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for such a fascinating sharing.
Yeah, you bet.
And we always end asking guests if there's anything that they'd like to share with the audience to help them lift their spirit. And you've mentioned quite a bit already, but
help them with their spirit. See, I think a lot of the folks we see that come into the yoga studio who are new think their body is their spirit. It's part of it. But we actually have 3 bodies. You have a physical body, an energy body, which is made up of your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions, and a spiritual body, which is your creative side and your belief system is kind of part of that spiritual body. And so our path, what we do at Roots to Wings is help people kind of reconnect to their physical bodies, because everybody wants to live forever, right? Many people do, and think their physical body is it. But the way to heal the physical body is actually to make a connection with the other two. And so if we can get people to make a connection to energy, which is beyond the five senses. So as I sit here and tap my fingers together, I've done it enough times, I can, like a Reiki practitioner, you can feel energy in between the palms of your hands. If you can make that connection and stay in that connection for as much of the day as possible, then that's you're giving. I feel like I'm giving myself the best chance to be in a place of expressing my spiritual connection, at all time. But that's why we ended up buying the yoga studio, because I wanted to have the time to practice that, and needed to have the time to practice that, because I'm a hard case. I need more harder training than most people.
Well, thank you so much
Yeah,
for your
thank you.
sharing and for you and Beth's good work in spreading the word and making it available to others.
Thank you so much for having me, and for allowing Roots to Wings to be a part of this.
Great.
It's wonderful.
Well, thank you,
Yeah.
Mike. This
Yeah,
was
you
really
bet.
great.